Hey everyone, and welcome to part 2 of how to make a jerkbait. So now that I've got my silicone mold made, I need to figure out how much resin to put into this thing. So I'm going to use a technique called the Archimedes dunk test of volume. If you want to find out more about that, you can Google it. But basically, I'm just going to push my master down into this container of water on top of a gram scale, and the amount in grams that I see is going to be about how much resin I'm going to need to pour into the mold. So it looks like it's going to be about 69 grams, but then my scale tips out, so I'm going to go with about 74 or 5. So the first thing I did was make a pure 100% resin copy. So I ended up making it 76 grams, and that was absolutely perfect to fill the mold. So what I'm going to use that for is a starting point. So when I start to mix the micro balloons into part A of the resin, I'm going to use a 10% mixture of the micro balloons to part A of the resin because I want this to be a little bit of a heavier bait. I don't want to have to add too much ballast. So that pure resin pour at the beginning gives me a good starting point. So now I'm just going to mix up 36 grams of part A of the resin, and I'm going to put 10% of that in micro balloons, so 3.6 grams of micro balloons. What the micro balloons do is they give the lure buoyancy, and they act as a counter force for the ballast that I'm going to put in later. So now I just need to get the micro balloons mixed into part A. So now add 36 grams of part B to the part A and the micro balloons, and I actually went a couple grams light because I think my scale had tared a couple grams off of 0, so I went 34 here, 34.5 about. Just going to brush some Vaseline into the mold to prep it for releasing easier once the resin has set. Now I'm just going to mix the resin until it starts to get warm and pour it into the mold. And this works much better if you actually get the resin into the mold and not all over it. All right, it's been about 10 minutes. This thing is set. It's actually still a little bit warm, so I'm just gonna be a little cautious when opening it just to make sure that there's no goo in there, and it looks good, so worked out. And it's normal to have some flashing around the edges of the baits. That's easily cleaned up. You can just break that right off. The bigger piece of flashing where the pour hole was, we'll take that off with the bandsaw in the next step. So now I'm just going to take off that extra chunk of resin and try not to make any mistakes. Foreshadowing. It was at this moment that he knew. He f***ed up. Alright, so a little plastic putty was enough to save me from that bandsaw accident. So now I'm just going to sand this thing down and get any imperfections out. Alright, so now just like we did in part 1, I'm going to install the hook hangers and line ties using 5-minute epoxy. I'm just going to use my reference jerkbait here to match up the point at which I want to install the belly hook hanger. All right, time for the dunk test. So I'm going to weigh the lure as it is currently with the hardware on it, so with the hooks and the split rings. Then I'm going to add ballast at different points and start dropping this thing into the tank and seeing how it floats, or actually how it sinks. And I'm really just guessing at this point. After that first drop in the tank, I'll have a better idea of where I need to adjust the weight and move it to. So that sank like a brick. Not really what I'm looking for. Gonna make an adjustment here and then drop it again. That looks a lot better. I actually removed the back weight completely. And that is slow and even and almost the perfect sink rate that I'm looking for. It was actually a little bit nose down, which is kind of what I want to go for. So now I'm just going to mark the spot where that lead was and then drill it out. So if you've seen other people making baits on YouTube, then this is going to be a familiar process. I've got some baking soda, I've got some thin super glue. I'm just going to start layering that stuff in and then sand it off after it's hardened. Now I'm just going to use a small block of wood here, wrap some sandpaper around it, and then sand this down smooth. I'm going to add the scales using lure tape I got from my dear friend Uwe. So what I did here was I just traced the outline of the bait on a piece of paper, and then I cut that outline out, and I'm going to use that outline to retrace it on the back of the lure tape. I'll cut that out, and then I'll have the shape I need to tape onto the lure for the scales. And you want to be careful when you're doing this. You just want to make sure that you get everything aligned properly, because if you don't get it aligned, it's going to look weird. And when you're putting this stuff on, you just kind of want to start in the middle and then work your way out to the edges. And what I'm using here is an embossing tool. You can get these on Amazon or any Hobby Lobby, any kind of craft store. I'm just going to use that to smooth out any wrinkles that might have formed when I taped it down to the edge. And if you use a heat gun, it'll make this stuff shrink up and fit snugly. And as you can see here, this stuff just looks really cool. It's a good alternative to actually painting the scales on. So when you do the second side, it's actually a little bit trickier because you need to get it lined up perfectly with the first side, so it may take you a couple of attempts. All right, there we go. This thing's looking good. Time for paint. So the first thing I need to do is blend in the edges where the foil meets the belly, because if I don't do that, it's going to be just too hard of a transition. So I'm going to use some thinned out transparent white and just build it up in layers. So I'm going to spray this at a pretty hard angle because what I want to avoid is a lot of overspray going on to the flank. I'm going to get overspray regardless. I'll take care of that with some water and a paper towel, but spraying at this angle will reduce the amount of overspray that actually gets onto the flank. So you can see here now that the foil actually blends in nicely to the belly. So I'm going to use some transparent yellow now to paint the back and the flanks. At first I thought I would only paint the flanks and the back and I would leave the head details for some moss green, but I think I'm going to go ahead and do the entire thing in transparent yellow. I'm using transparent because if I were to use opaque, I would lose all the scale detail. So using transparent, those scales are going to show up pretty nicely through that paint. Moving on to some detail moss green for the back, the flanks, and the head. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to spray that moss green at an angle down the flank, and that's going to blend in the yellow really well. Now some transparent black that I'm going to spray across the back and allow it to overspray down the flanks. And that's going to create a really nice blended look with that green as well. Now before I start painting the gill plates and the fin details, I'm going to hit this thing with a clear coat, a transparent base. That will protect the paint that I've already put on here. And then I'm going to take this thing inside, put one coat of epoxy on it, and then bring it back out and finish up. Alright, so now I've got a coat of epoxy on here, and using a stencil, I got a little bit ahead of myself and forgot to hit record, but I used transparent white to start the gill details using a stencil that I made. Now I'm going over that transparent white with some transparent yellow. Now I'm just going to tape on the stencil for the back gill plate and do the exact same thing, transparent white and then transparent yellow. So that is looking pretty sweet. Now I'm going to use some transparent black for the eye shading. And some transparent black here to blend in the gills. And some detail moss green here just to blend in the gill plates at the bottom. And I apologize, my camera shut off before I realized it and before I finished the fins, but same process. Started with transparent white, moved on to transparent yellow, added some detail moss green for shading on the outsides of the fins, and yeah, so let me show you the finished product. So hopefully you guys liked what you saw here. Hopefully you learned something. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notifications bell to be notified each time I release new content. Thanks for watching.